In this video, I'm gonna share 5 tips for better landscape telephoto pictures. Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto. I'm a photographer and a Lumix ambassador from Helsinki, Finland. And in this video, I'm gonna share some tips on how to make better pictures on your telephoto lens. Usually, when we talk about landscape photography, we also think about wide-angle lens. But there is no best lens for landscape photography. And while wide angles are generally maybe associated with landscape photography, a telephoto lens is a much easier lens for landscape photography. It's much easier to make pictures on a telephoto lens, landscape photos on a telephoto lens, than it is with a wide angle lens. And in this video, I have 5 tips for you how to do that. But before I go to those tips, please consider to subscribe to my channel and tap the bell right there so you'll get a notification every time I post a new video. All the pictures that I'm gonna show you in this video were shot on the Lumix S1R and the 70-200 f4 lens. But of course these tips are good for any camera lens combination. I just happen to use this because I like it a lot and I'm a Lumix ambassador. But now let's go to the tip number 1. A telephoto lens gives you the reach. A telephoto allows you to shoot from a distance and it allows you to reach some subjects that you otherwise could not reach. It allows you to cut pieces of the scene and capture them. And it also allows you to capture some wildlife that would not allow you to get any closer. Here's an example of some birds that I happened to come by the other day when I was walking in one of the recreational areas here in Helsinki. The birds are not that far away, but I was not gonna walk on the water to reach them, and the birds were already suspicious from this distance. So the only chance to make this picture was to use a telephoto lens. And I think it's a nice picture. The birds are not that big in the frame, but it shows some of the surroundings too. And a telephoto is also very good for some details, because you can keep a convenient distance. Here's another example of a dead branch that I photographed the other day. I was able to stand and very conveniently take the picture. If I had a shorter lens, I would have had to crawl in the dirt to get a similar picture of the same subject. So a telephoto is also very good for some detail shots. Understand the perspective compression. Of course, there is no real perspective compression. It is just an optical illusion. The distant objects seem to be closer together than they actually is. We just can't see it with our bare eyes. We need a telephoto lens to be able to see that. However, if we take a wide-angle photograph and we zoom in far enough into that photo, we can see the telephoto, the compressed telephoto picture in there when we zoom in far enough. But you can use that optical illusion to flatten out and simplify your scene, and you need a telephoto lens to be able to do that. And I'm going to talk more about that in a while when I talk about the composition. Use selective focus. Usually when we take landscape photos on a wide-angle lens, we want everything to be in focus. But selective focus can also be used for landscape photography with very good results, and you're gonna need a telephoto lens for that. With a long lens, it's possible to use selective focus also for some distant subjects. And also with a long lens, you can crop in tighter to isolate the subject from the scene. But sometimes it of course can also be a downside because you just can't get everything in focus no matter what you do, unless you do some special tricks like focus stacking, for example. Selective focus can be a bit more difficult on a Micro Four Thirds gear than it is with a full frame gear, but you just have to use a little bit longer focal length and you'll be able to isolate your subject even if it's a little bit further away. Here's another sample picture of some birds in the water, and I really like this picture. The birds are tiny in the foreground, but they are clearly isolated with the shallow depth of field, and you can see the big sea in the background and some islands back there, and it gives you some perspective and some idea of the living environment of these birds. And here's another example of some trees. It's very difficult to make even remotely interesting picture like this on a wide-angle lens, but on a telephoto it's much easier, and also the selective focus really works here and makes the picture, gives some depth to the picture, and it makes it looks more interesting. And this one is related to the previous one. Always make sure you nail your focus. If you shoot landscapes on a wide-angle lens, you usually focus somewhere in the scene, a little bit further away, and then stop down a few clicks and everything's in focus. But on a telephoto lens, as we spoke before, the depth of field is always much shallower than a wide-angle lens. Then, and because of that, you have to always focus on your main subject and make sure you nail the focus. Sometimes even a minor focusing error makes a big difference. With a wide angle, it doesn't really matter that much because there's plenty of depth of field, but with a telephoto, you have to be very careful and always focus on your main subject. And before I talk about the composition, if you like this video, please buy me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below. It would mean a lot to me and it helps me to make more of these videos for you. And now let's talk about the composition on a telephoto lens. Composing a telephoto landscape photo is really simple because you don't have that huge foreground to deal with. You can easily remove all the unnecessary stuff and just pick some parts of the scene. And you can arrange your scene into layers, or you can even create interesting surfaces on a telephoto lens. And that would be a lot harder on a wide-angle lens. But if you arrange your scene into layers, just make sure you focus on the main layer in the scene, because that's your main subject. If your focus is on the wrong layer, then the picture is probably useless. And if you decide to arrange your scene into layers, usually an unsharp front layer works really nicely against a sharp background layer. Of course, there are other ways to arrange the layers, but this arrangement usually works really well. Shoot a panorama. A telephoto lens works really well for panoramic shots because you get a lot less or almost no perspective distortion compared to a wide-angle lens. Because with a wide-angle lens, the relative distance from your camera to your subject varies a lot when you pan along the scene to get the individual shots that you take to create the panorama. The mid part of the scene is a lot closer to your camera than the left or the right side of the scene. But on a telephoto lens, because you are so much further away from your subject, the relative distance from your camera to the scene stays much more uniform or similar all the way when you pan across the scene to get the individual shots that you use to create the final panoramic shot. Here's one example that I took of the port of Helsinki, and this is made of 12 individual vertical shots that I combined in Lightroom. And by the way, the final size of the picture is about 275 megapixels, which is kind of ridiculous, I think. And the last but not the least, the exposure settings. And I think this is already the 7th tip, but who cares? On a telephoto lens, you have to watch your shutter speed, because if your shutter speed is too long, then you're gonna end up with shaky pictures that are probably not usable. And on a telephoto lens, you get those shaky pictures much easier than on a wide-angle lens, and that's why it's important to keep an eye on the shutter speed, especially if you're using aperture priority mode like I do most of the time. One solution is to turn on the auto ISO, but in my opinion, many cameras crank up the ISO a little bit too early and too high. And of course, you can always put your camera on a tripod and then you can be sure there's no camera shake in your pictures. I'm a little bit lazy and I don't like to use a tripod, and I usually rely on the excellent dual IS on my Lumix camera, and I just make sure the shutter speed stays within the limits of my hand-holding capabilities. But whatever method you prefer, just make sure the shutter speed stays within your hand-holding capabilities. And here's one more telephoto related video you may want to watch after this. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.